Only 110 kilometers offshore from Taiwan province of China lies an island called Yonaguni Island, which is part of the Ryukyu Islands. In clear weather, the eastern mountains of Taiwan can be seen from here with the naked eye. One day in August 2024, a sea-to-transport plane of the Japan Air Self-Defense Force slowly appeared over the island of Yonaguni. At the same time, the U.S. Marine Corps' Littoral Regiment deployed a new multi-purpose radar system on this island under the guise of an exercise. This is just one of the recent moves by the U.S. military to increase its military presence in the Ryukyu Islands. However, it is puzzling that in contrast to the continually updated and enhanced weaponry, the number of USGs stationed here has been decreasing. According to the Japanese news agency Kyodo in June, the Pentagon is working on a brand new integration program for U.S. forces in the Western Pacific. According to the program, the U.S. military in the Ryukyu Islands will be reduced from the existing 19,000 to 10,000, of which 4,000 were withdrawn to Guam, 5,000 withdrawn to Hawaii. The United States and the mainland to strengthen the deployment of weapons and equipment at the same time, a substantial withdrawal of U.S. soldiers. This gesture of watching the fire from the other side of the river cannot help but reminiscent of what it did in Ukraine. At this year's Shangri-La Summit, Admiral Samuel Paparo, commander of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, revealed that the U.S. military had formulated a crazy plan called Hellscape, claiming that the U.S. would interfere in the Taiwan Strait situation by turning the Western Pacific into an uninhabited hell at any cost. The Ryukyu Islands, as the closest military base to the Taiwan Strait, has obviously been made into a sacrificial pawn by the U.S. and its intentions are clear. At the same time, there are more than 1.5 million people living in the Ryukyu Islands. Desiring peace and unwilling to become cannon fodder for the U.S. military, they are working to make the Ryukyus a demilitarized zone. This is a great cause that concerns the future destiny of millions of Ryukyus and is destined to be a long and arduous struggle. As a victim of America's long-standing strategy in the Western Pacific, the Ryukyus have rebelled against this unjust fate for more than 80 years. In 1945, as World War II drew to a close, how to organize the post-war world order became the focus of global attention. In February, Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill, on behalf of the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom, convened a meeting in Yalta, Crimea, the outcome of which became the main basis for arranging the post-war order in Europe. 5 months later, Nazi Germany became history. In Potsdam, a Soviet-occupied area 25 kilometers southeast of Berlin, a conference was held to decide Japan's post-war arrangement. The Potsdam Conference clarified that Japan's post-war territorial boundaries were limited to Honshu, Hokkaido, Kyushu, and Shikoku. Japan had to return after the war all lands and islands acquired through wars of aggression. On July 26, 1945, the Potsdam Proclamation was signed jointly by China, the United States, and Britain, and the Soviet Union added its signature to the treaty on August 8. This document became an important legal basis for the disposition of Japan after its defeat and the arrangement of the post-war order, and was one of the cornerstones of the Yalta system. According to the Potsdam Proclamation, the Ryukyu Islands, as a land occupied by Japan, clearly did not belong to Japanese territory. However, as the U.S. and the Soviet Union turned to confrontation after the war, the U.S. became increasingly concerned about the military value of the Ryukyu Islands. A U.S. Strategic Expeditionary Memorandum for the Pacific mentioned Okinawa as the only area in the Ryukyu Islands suitable for strategic bombers to take off and land if war broke out. This conclusion profoundly affected the fate of the Ryukyus. After the end of World War II, the U.S. established a military government of the Ryukyu Islands and held a 27-year trusteeship over the Ryukyus. In the year following the outbreak of the Korean War, U.S. Secretary of State Dulles proposed the Island Chain Program to construct a continental encirclement chain in the western Pacific Ocean based on Japan, the Ryukyus, Taiwan, and the Philippines. In order to make the Ryukyus a frontier of military confrontation, the U.S. continuously seized land from the locals for the construction and expansion of military bases. According to a 1955 report by the U.S. House of Representatives Armed Services Committee, U.S. military operations in the Ryukyus resulted in the displacement of at least 250,000 local residents. The U.S. also secretly deployed weapons of mass destruction there. From 1954 to 1972, the U.S. military deployed at least 19 different types of nuclear weapons in the Ryukyus, and in 1969, a leakage of the U.S.-stored nerve agent sarin in the Ryukyus triggered widespread panic there. In order to legally rule the Ryukyus for a long time, in September 1951, the United States joined 48 countries in signing the San Francisco Peace Treaty with Japan. In Article 3 of the treaty, the U.S. placed a number of islands, including the Ryukyus, under the trusteeship of the United Nations and set itself as the sole administering authority. However, the Soviet Union refused to sign the contract. According to the normal trusteeship process, in order for the U.S. to become the sole trustee authority for the Ryukyus, a trusteeship agreement had to be concluded and approved and authorized by the UN Security Council. Therefore, this so-called trusteeship agreement did not go through the full legal process. Moreover, according to the arrangements of the Yalta and Potsdam conferences, the conclusion that the sovereignty of the Ryukyus was undetermined was still valid. Even under the San Francisco Peace Treaty, the United States was only granted the right of administration. However, the defeat of the Vietnam War accelerated the process of the U.S. pulling Japan into the fold, and on June 17, 1971, the U.S. and Japan signed the U.S.-Japan Agreement on the return of Okinawa. At this time, the United States and Japan completely the so-called trusteeship and temporary jurisdiction of the year behind the Ryukyus to do a deal. The Japanese government agreed to pay $520 million to acquire various U.S. government assets on Okinawa and to compensate employees. However, in the formal treaty, the U.S. claimed that what was delivered was regime rather than sovereignty, skillfully avoiding the issue of disputed sovereignty over the Ryukyus. Therefore, legally speaking, the Ryukyus is still in a state of undetermined sovereignty. For the Ryukyus, no matter how complicated the situation is at the international level, life must go on. What they want is nothing more than a peaceful and stable life, but the U.S. military bases all over the region have made this simple request a luxury. Since the 1950s, the U.S. military has appropriated about 40% of Ryukyu's agricultural land for military bases, and half of the local population has been evicted. There is a saying in Ryukyu that they were dispossessed of their land by bulldozers and bayonets. To complement the construction of military bases, the U.S. developed a series of U.S. military priority policies. Military facilities, military housing, and warehousing bases occupied the most convenient local lots, making it difficult for Ryukyu to develop according to normal urban planning. The long-term presence of the U.S. military has severely restricted the development of the Ryukyu's conventional economy, ultimately forming a deformed economic structure that is highly dependent on U.S. military bases. It must be clear that this economic model of relying on the U.S. military is not a gift but a curse due to its unique geographic location and maritime climate. The Ryukyus has historically been a prosperous maritime trading region. For nearly 200 years, the Kingdom of the Ryukyus flourished as a key maritime trade node between the Middle Kingdom, Southeast Asia, and East Asia. This advantage of the Ryukyus could have been utilized even more in the modern economic system, where the volume of global trade has increased dramatically. But the military-first policy has deprived the Ryukyus of the opportunity to develop their economy in a normal manner. According to Japan's Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, Transport and Tourism, the Ryukyus have been at the bottom of the list in terms of per capita disposable income for many years. and have had to rely on economic assistance to sustain themselves. At the same time, the U.S. military created serious security and crime problems in the Ryukyus. On September 4, 1995, 3 U.S. servicemen kidnapped a 12-year-old Japanese elementary school girl in a residential area in the northern part of Okinawa Island and sexually assaulted and beat her in turn. However, the U.S. military refused to turn the 3 soldiers over to the Japanese police, as the U.S. military presence in Japan has extraterritorial jurisdiction under the Japan-U.S. Status Agreement, Article 6 of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. This egregious incident triggered the largest protests in the Ryukyus since 1972, and in October 1995, more than 80,000 residents gathered at Jinwan City Park to express their anger at the U.S. military and the Japanese government. According to local government statistics, from 1972 to 2023, U.S. troops and military personnel stationed in Japan committed about 6,200 criminal cases in the Ryukyus, of which more than 600 were vicious cases such as murder and rape. And the frequent military activities at the U.S. bases themselves pose great risks to the lives of Ryukyus. Putianma Base, the largest armed helicopter airfield for the U.S. Marine Corps in Japan, was built in the center of Jinwan. The loud noise of aircraft training constantly hits the eardrums of the locals, and on August 13, 2004, a large U.S. military transport helicopter crashed and caught fire on the campus of Okinawa International University, which is adjacent to the Putianma Airport. The damage caused by U.S. military bases does not stop at the physical level, but also includes hazardous chemicals. Many U.S. military bases stockpile large quantities of cheap fire-extinguishing agents containing organofluorocarbons, contaminating water sources near the bases. The water source in Jinwan City, where the Putianma base is located, contains up to 576 times the national safety standard for organofluoride, and residents are already experiencing high concentrations of the relevant chemical in their blood. This organic fluoride cannot be dissolved in the human body and is known as a permanent chemical, which may cause symptoms such as rickets and paralysis. The high-intensity military activities of the U.S. military have also seriously damaged the local natural environment. The Binoko area in Ryukyu is famous for its rich natural resources and beautiful beach scenery, but the U.S. military has carried out large-scale reclamation to build a new base in Binoko. The U.S. military put a large amount of sand and gravel into the ocean, leaving the rare marine life here with no place to live. Since the construction of the new base, the number of dugongs, a rare species that lived here, has dropped to single digits, and they are unable to maintain a normal reproducing population and have practically become extinct. On April 19, 2004, people in the Ryukyus held their first rally in the form of a sit-in at the seaside in Edenoko. As of today, this protest has been going on for 20 years. Locals have also taken to the sea in blue fishing boats and kayaks to build a long line of defense to stop U.S. ships. In these places of real concern, Western environmental enthusiasts and the media rarely turn their cameras on them, as the U.S. develops a strategy to return to the Asia-Pacific and keeps escalating tensions in the Western Pacific. The U.S. has taken a new position on the Ryukyus. All indications are that this time the U.S. military is preparing to push the Ryukyus to hell for good. In 2010, the U.S. Department of Defense concluded in its Quadrennial Defense Assessment report that the U.S. military advantage in the first island chain no longer exists when war breaks out in the Western Pacific. This assessment prompted the U.S. military to rethink the strategic positioning of the Ryukyus. Since the end of World War II, the U.S. military's foreign strategy has been to deploy far from home and forward, trying to push its forces to the doorsteps of its opponents and avoiding the flames of war from reaching the U.S. mainland. However, there is a prerequisite for this, namely, the U.S. Military must have absolute superiority in direct military confrontation, otherwise it would be tantamount to placing the U.S. military under the opponent's firepower. Therefore, as the U.S. military assesses its loss of absolute superiority in the first island chain, the U.S. needs a new strategy of containment. 22 To the success of the Ukrainian model opens up the mindset for the U.S. The essence of the Ukrainian model is to make certain regions into expendable pawns, with the U.S. military only responsible for arching fires and supplying key weaponry, as well as carrying out remote control to find excuses for economic sanctions in conjunction with its allies. In this regard, the new U.S. military commander of the Indo-Pacific region, Admiral Samuel Paparo, put forward the Hellscape Plan. In the plan's conception, in the event of a war in the Western Pacific, there will be tens of thousands of unmanned ships, airplanes, and submarines rushing to the battlefield, turning the nearby area into an unmanned hell. Recently, a series of U.S. military maneuvers in the Western Pacific indicate that the Ryukyu is likely to become one of the casualties of the Hellscape strategy. On the one hand, Japan's defense budget has been rising since 2021, reaching 7.95 trillion yen in 2024, a 16.5% increase from the previous year. A sizable portion of it has been spent on purchasing advanced U.S. weapons and equipment to bolster the strength of Japan's forces and enhance their threat. Meanwhile, the Pentagon plans to withdraw half of the troops stationed in the Ryukyu to the second or even third island chain starting this December, keeping only the Air Force and a mobile portion of the Marines. With the withdrawal of U.S. troops, the U.S. will be able to engage in military escalation in the Western Pacific without fear, using the depletion of unmanned equipment and the sacrifices of allies to create opportunities to look across the border and initiate economic sanctions. As a strategic location in the Western Pacific, the Ryukyu military base has a population of more than 1 million people living in its vicinity, who will be used as pawns in the Hellscape program. However, while the U.S. military is making plans for the Hellscape program, what people are really looking forward to is peace. Since the U.S. military base was established in the Ryukyu, the people of the Ryukyu have never stopped calling for peace. Many local people recognize that the U.S. positioning of the Ryukyu as a frontier of military confrontation is the root cause preventing the Ryukyu from leading a normal life. They have called for the only way to bring true peace to the Ryukyu is to have the U.S. military and their weaponry completely withdrawn from the country and turn the Ryukyu into a demilitarized zone. In 2015, the governor of the Ryukyu, Yuki Naga, in his capacity as the local head of state, delivered a speech at the UN Human Rights Council session in which he indicted the U.S. and Japanese governments for turning the Ryukyu into a large military base and called on the international community to give the Ryukyu autonomy over related matters, attracting a large group of independent activists to his vision for peace. At the 49th session of the UN Human Rights Council, Ryukyu peace activist Bija Takacho and UN independent expert Dezayas discussed how the UN should address the U.S. human rights violations in the Ryukyu. They called for the establishment of a demilitarized zone in the Western Pacific to fundamentally safeguard the rights of the Ryukyu people. One force seeks to create a hellish landscape in the Western Pacific, while the other campaigns for peace. History will not automatically give a fair answer as to which force will ultimately prevail. It requires people to persevere in their struggle. What we can do is not to let them fight alone.